بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. Okay, inshallah we'll be covering chapter 6 today, and perhaps chapter 7 and 8 as well, because they're very short chapters. So we resume our thematic reading into instruction of the student by Imam al-Zarnuji. May Allah be pleased with him. So chapter 5, if you guys would remember from last time, we covered the idea about the role of character in learning. And this time we cover the actual learning process itself. We'll delve into some tools, not all of them, but some tools that Imam al-Zarnuji mentioned that al-muta'allim, or the learner, would use throughout his learning process. Most of the tools that Imam al-Zarnuji have mentioned in this chapter are sort of organizational tools that the learner would use to manage the learning process itself. He did not go into the intricate details of how to read a text, for example, or what to do when you need to work out a meaning out of a treatise or a learning manual. But what he focused on is the management of the learning itself, not the nitty-gritty methods of understanding a text or understanding any kind of learning content. The reason behind this is he's trying to lay out a framework for the learners. He's not providing these as I said, these specific tools, because tools for understanding might differ from one discipline to another. Okay, so he's kind of leaving that out for the learner's experience throughout the learning process, and also for the teacher of that specific discourse, of that specific discipline. So he's leaving that out for the teacher to lay out for the student and to illustrate for the student. But he wants the student, before entering, to understand the tools for the management of learning, so to speak. Okay. But he does refer to certain methods or certain ways that you might apply if you want to learn something. I didn't see you, Ashraf. So, all right. So the very first thing that he started with is the beginning. When to start a course, or when to start learning something, which day of the week. And yes, and the day that he mentioned was Wednesday, because there is a narration, even though it might be a weak narration, that anything that starts on a Wednesday will be perfected, so to speak. All right, and this was narrated also from the Hanafi tradition, all along to Imam Abu Hanifa himself, that he would prefer starting things on his new endeavors would start on a Wednesday. And you guys might ask, why did they choose Wednesday even though the narration is weak? Well, see, this is also a jurist approach that he's applying. The jurists, especially Hanafis, along with other jurists of the four school of thoughts, the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali, they would rather use a weak narration when they want to do something like, something that is beneficial but not necessarily an obligation, rather than, to do an arbitrary decision like to randomly select out of your own, trial and error experiences, even though part of their selection sometimes because of a certain tradition that came about or blossomed from a trial and error period. But again, they would rather use a narration that is weak than choosing, a random selection on their own. All right, and this creates two things. First is, there is strong attachment to the Sunnah, even though the narration is weak, and a weak narration does not necessarily become a false narration. a narration, for it to be correct, there must be evidence for the correct narration. This hadith is correct, it has been validated according to the isnad or the chain of narration. Anything that did not meet the criteria for a hadith to be correct is considered to be weak. But the weak narrations are two kinds. One kind that we were able to falsify. We have been able to prove that this narration is false. The other part is a narration that we were not able to prove that is false, but at the same time we're not able to prove that it is correct, so it becomes automatically weak. You understand? So weakness has two levels, or two main levels. The first level is something that we could not prove for it to be correct, and the other that we were able to falsify. And the first level, the first grade of weak narrations is the ones that they use when they want to decide on a measurement or an amount of something that has been mentioned in the Sharia in a general form, but the application of it was not mentioned. So they have two options. Either they decide on their own, or they find a narration from the Sunnah that is not false, but might be weak. You understand? And this counters the Salafi approach, which is if we were able to validate the hadith is correct, we'll take it, otherwise we would not take it. And this now seems who's more attachable to the Sunnah, who's trying not to do anything unless there is some kind of an athar, a narration that is coming from the pious predecessors. All right, like to keep the tradition intact, and this also adds another realm to choosing the day from the week to begin with, the realm of identity, having some sort of a tradition. Schools around the globe, especially those schools, if you take, for example, Ivy League universities in America, the Ivy League universities, each university has its own tradition. All right. I mentioned in the very beginning the Cornell note-taking system that was developed by Pauk, and Professor Pauk is from Cornell University. But once he initiated that, it was simple. If you take a look at the Cornell note-taking system, it's a very simple system to take notes. But at the same time, because it was very much celebrated by students and people in the field, they attributed the system to the university and became the Cornell note-taking system. So, alhamdulillah. So there's a sense of identity here, all right? A sense of culture, a tradition for the school that you're learning from, or that you're attaining knowledge at. So yes, they chose Wednesday, one part because of the narration, the weak narration, and on the other hand, is something that gives an angle of tradition and a sense of identity for the learner as well. Because when he chooses Wednesday, he would say, "I'm choosing Wednesday because Imam Abu Hanifa used to do this." Because there is a narration from the Prophet ﷺ that used to do that. So that gives some sense of identity and also some sense of seriousness. I'm not choosing Wednesday because it's just an arbitrary, random selection that I did, but it's rather because there is some sort of, a preceding procedure and something that has been done that way in the past as well. So it makes it more, it has a much deeper sense in choosing the day to begin with. Applying this today, we don't have to start everything on Wednesdays. But what they're mentioning is that even in the terms of the choosing day, which day should we start? Should we select to start a course or an event or something of that sort? Perhaps the idea of tradition should be in our minds. All right? So, look, hypothetically, if Al-Azhar here had some kind, or the scholars at Al-Azhar have some kind of a tradition in the way they start, or the timing of their start. Today, for example, in the modern day, the start of the semesters, the beginning and the ending of semesters, this falls in the realm of tradition, and when to begin and when to finish and so forth, and when do the exams start and when do they end. So the idea is not that we don't have to stick to Wednesday. Of course, if we can do that, that would be interesting. That would be something good. But at the same time, what we're trying to to do when we contextualize this, to put it into our modern day context, is that choose something, choose a day, choose a beginning, have some sense of tradition when you're organizing the time of the learning process. All right. He moves on after that to the what he calls the beginner's amount. When you're beginning into learning something, what is the amount that should be given to the beginner, or what is the amount that the beginner should focus on or concentrate on while learning? And what he chose, or what he described, is something that, if repeated twice, would be remembered. That would only need 2 repetitions. So we would take it once, repeat it twice, and it's there. You can remember it then. If you try to apply it on modern day, academics, that would be very, very small chunks, very small, very little. And that says, show if you take a look at this, and then compare it with the modern day learning techniques that is being applied, whether in academia or in the Islamic circles that facilitate Islamic education and tradition and so forth. There's a huge contradiction from how we treat beginners nowadays and how back then they used to treat beginners. Beginners back then, there are 2 levels of beginners. There's the beginners, the lower beginners, the beginning of the beginning, sort of speak. And this is what he's describing. And usually, what they get words, they get knowledge from the words of the scholars. They don't get assigned textbooks. It's usually simple, to the point, simple explanations, like how we use now PowerPoints that are very simple and to the point, and the amount of the knowledge that is prescribed or that is described to the learner is very little, as much as something that after 2 repetitions he would remember afterwards. Remember and understand, of course. We talk about repetitions after the understanding phase has been covered. And when you see, if we take, for example, the Islamic Sharia part, when you find people, trying to explain to amateurs, the book Al by Imam al-Shafi'i, and you take an amateur trying to explain like a book, several volumes to a beginner, that doesn't work. When you take an amateur, any kind of science, and you try to explain a textbook, that it doesn't work out that way. People struggle trying to finish the textbook, trying to get over the material. And what we find sometimes in modern day universities here in Egypt, the professors or the people, the supervisors of the academia, they start, canceling out chapters from the curriculum, or doing just certain selections. And why did you assign that textbook to begin with? Why don't you give them a small book that people can finish? Compare that to the West, for example. And you find in the West they do these very small books, like Economics for Dummies or something like that. And unfortunately, people here in Egypt, they translate for dummies literally. Like they say al-aghbiya. Economics was not made for stupid people, but dummies, you have to put it in context. What they mean dummies, that they don't know anything yet about economics. But anyways, other than the literal translation of dummies on the cover of textbooks, but something like this, economics for dummies, philosophy for dummies, business networking for dummies, and you name it. There's a chicken soup series also for different kinds of things. If you take a chapter out of these kinds of books, the introductory books or introduction to blah blah blah, whatever. If you take these introductions, you would find that if you take a 1 page or 2 pages and you understand it and you repeat it twice, most probably you will remember what has been what was written there and what you read. So introductions should be short and should be at the same time in a language that a learner would remember. And now there's a misconception. I'm sorry that I would mention some things regarding the religious education. You'd find, because I know some of you are interested more into the secular education. Well, not secular, but into the other realms of. I'm just joking. The other realms of studies. But you find here in religious traditions, you find the beginners studying mutun, the very concise introductory treatise that is, was originally written at some point for beginners. But the point here is the way the scholars or the teachers would deal with the learner trying to read, trying to go through these texts. These texts have been summarized in a way that one sentence would, be packed with information. And usually learners, they're not ready to read that kind of text in modern day. They don't have enough Arabic for it, and they did not grow up going through these kind of summaries. So a beginner who's in the very fresh beginner should not be even given a textbook or even a manual like the Mutun, but should be given something, an introduction like professor's notes or something like that, with very primary kind of information. All right, so this is a measurement way that Imam al-Zarnuji proposed, is something that is the amount for the beginner, something that he can remember after 2 repetitions. All right, and for something to be remembered by 2 repetitions, that would require 2 things. One, the amount should be small, and it should be easy as well. Because I could give you 1 sentence, but the sentence is very complicated, that it would take you, more than 2 repetitions for you to remember it. And the idea is not just remembering the words, and we'll get into this. The idea is not only remembering the words, but also be able to remember the meaning. And I want you to distinguish between these 2 things. You can remember words, but you cannot recall the meaning. It's reciting something that you don't understand. The most important is to remember the meaning. And this is why memory and understanding, they're both, interconnected. Unfortunately, because we have been taught memorization in the Arab world in the wrong way, people now have this kind of negative attitude towards memorization. So they would say either you understand or you memorize. You cannot mix both. But you use your memory in learning. If you want to take out memory from learning, then you're joking. You don't understand. You don't understand cognitive processes to begin with. Let alone educational processes. You cannot recall any kind of information unless you have memory, unless it has been stored in your memory at some point. So, talking about knowledge without memory, then this is false. But what you want people to focus on is retaining the long-term retention of meanings, not necessarily the words. Then that's correct. But taking out memorization, because people have been applying it in the wrong way, that's not right. Just coach people how to memorize in a way that enhances their comprehension, but not to create, a sense or a feeling of hostility between memory and comprehension. All right. All right. And then he mentioned on page 47, after he mentioned at the end of page 46 the importance of the small amount for the beginners, and then he moved on page 47 to talk about the gradual increase. That the idea of gradual perceptual amounts for the learners is imperative. Imam al-Ghazali has talked about this in Sahih Bukhari, and I mentioned this here before, narrated from Ibn Abbas, may Allah be pleased with both of them. He said, الرباني الذي يعلم الناس صغار العلم قبل كباره. The person who walks, the guided scholar, so to speak, the guided teacher, the guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the one that teaches people, the things for beginners before the things for the experts. Alright? And he said, صغار العلم, meaning the beginning, the small amounts of the knowledge before the big amounts. And one of the key ways to know that the person is not a good teacher, and also to know that this person may be a deviator, is to talk to general masses, to the public, into complex issues in knowledge, and yet people are not aware of them. And Imam al-Ghazali has warned in Ihya Ulumuddin, has warned the learner not to study with people that when he sits, to receive knowledge from them, they would start telling him all the complexities and different in arguments and the, and the debates of the discourse or the discipline that they're trying to learn. He said, if you find the teacher explaining to you the debates to begin with, walk away. The debates are for the experts. If you take a beginner and everything that he knows is debates, what are you doing? You're creating this habit of, debating for the sake of debating. Not debating because to seek out knowledge. Remember, the mindset for the learner, for the beginner, is for what? To receive knowledge. Right? So if I give him knowledge in the form of debates, he would start thinking what? That everything in knowledge is debates. It's all about debating, it's all about argument, it's all about complexities, it's all about being perplexed, which is correct and which is false. And what they do, they say, the true scholar is the one that knows the difference in opinions. Yes, the scholar, not the beginner. Yes, the scholar must know the differences in opinions. But this is the scholar, the teacher himself, not the beginner. The beginner needs to know the baby steps. These are the foundations, the cornerstones, the beginning layers to begin, a journey in learning, but not to throw all the differences and debates to begin with. So there must be a gradual increase. So if you are a learner, again, see here, Imam al-Zarnuji, and also I guess he is sort of following Imam al-Ghazali in this. He's throwing the responsibility on the learner, because they would not be able to go to every single teacher, every single circle, and even to see which teacher is following the right way or not. Again, which is really interesting, if you note this, how Imam al-Ghazali and now Imam al-Zarnuji and others were empowering learners more than teachers at some points. I'm not saying everything, but at some points, they wanted the learner to be aware of things. All right, and it's very interesting because they go grassroots. You're going to the learner himself or herself before they even indulge into any kind of circle. And it's something universal. Even what we're saying, you can apply it to academia nowadays, and you can apply it to religious circles as well. It's not something that is limited to Islamic Sharia or the study of Islamic Sharia. If you go to study, any kind of physics 101, and you find or any kind of let's say engineering, what you should do, you should take mechanics 101, not quantum, physics and quantum mechanics and things like that, right? You take the very beginning steps. So if you find the professor always throwing things at you that is higher than your level, then there is a problem. Not higher than your level, higher than the level of a beginner. Note, because the learner, some learners might be, slacking. Just to keep that in mind. Another issue, a teacher may mention something that is, from a higher level to get the learners motivated. We're not critiquing this. What we're critiquing is having the methodology itself, around the notion of debate or arguments or difference in opinions for a beginner. Okay? Why do we need gradual increase? Because this is the only way you can sustain competence in something. The idea of tiny achievements or mini achievements. This is how you develop habits, by the way. You develop habits step by step. You don't start developing a habit in anything unless you take it usually step by step, whether it's a good habit or a bad habit. Those who needed to develop the habit of prayer, it took them time to do it step by step, gradually. In the beginning, they would miss a couple of prayers. Perhaps they would pray not in the correct way, and then gradually speaking, they began to develop the habit of prayer. It's not difficult anymore. It's something. It became part of their lifestyle, part of their identity, also part of their personality. So it doesn't require mental or psychological effort to work out the reasoning of, now it's time to pray and I must go pray. They don't have to go through that, psychological, mujahada, so to speak. All right, they don't have to, enter a war with their desires and combat, procrastination. They don't have to do that anymore. They worked out in a gradual way, in a way that the habit, worked out its way. Okay. All right. So this is one. The other. So this is prayer. The other notion is, something that is a bad habit, like smoking. Most people who smoke, do they start with a pack of cigarettes? No. A beginner in smoking would never be able to begin with a pack of cigarettes. Right? We have to understand how we are as humans to change things. They would start in the beginning with one cigarette, couple, a handful, and then they might finish 2 packs a day eventually. Why? Because they develop this habit in a gradual sense. Any kind of habit must go through this gradual step by step. All right. So what he's doing is he's using that mechanism of gradual development of habits and applying it in learning. All right, we can wait for the adhan to finish and then we'll resume, inshallah. Okay, so coming back. So we're talking about the importance of doing things in a gradual way. This whole idea of simple steps or tiny achievements that accumulate over time. Many people have been talking about this now, whether in learning or into understanding of the development of habits, or even mathematically speaking. I mentioned here before probably the Improbability Principle by David Hand. It's an interesting book. You might want to take a look at it. He's talking about this notion from the perspective of mathematics. He does take this into the notion of miracles and so forth, but you can put that aside, but focus on the idea of perceptual gaining over time. How if you do something for a long period of time, and we'll mention this idea of how to develop an expert performance in something, how many hours you might want or you might need for that. So the idea of perceptual gain. And Imam Tajuddin Subki is a great Shafi'i scholar. He wrote in the biographies, in the Tabaqat, or the biographies of the Shafi'i scholar, he said, what it means in Arabic, it was something like yushak أو yushik من واظب على شيء أن يفتح له منه. It's almost for somebody, if I can't recall the exact words unfortunately, but somebody who's determined and persistent in one, in front of one door, knocking that same door over and over and over again, persistently for a long period of time, most likely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open that door for him and open other doors from that door, that will be the gateway for him. He mentioned that, and I mentioned in previous events when we talk about learning how to learn, I mentioned the quotes in Arabic by Sheikh Zarruq, and also by Shahabuddin Suhrawardi, when they talk about the importance of, if you focus on the very small parts, the very, the tiny blocks, and you keep doing that over and over and over again, over time or by time, most likely you will get, an exponential gain in this particular field or in this particular area. All right. He then mentioned something else. He's just recapping this notion. He talked about how we should start small, and we start with the most readily understood and retained information. And I want you not to confuse yourself with two notions. There's a notion in learning that talks about how you should eat your frogs first. That's an idiom, meaning start with the most difficult. And here he's saying start with the most readily understood and that can be easily retained. We'll see, when those who say start with the most difficult, they're talking about most difficult tasks in general. Alright, so now he's talking about the difficulty of the task in comparison to other tasks. But Imam al-Zarnuji is not talking about the difficulty of a task. He's talking about the difficulty of a content regarding to different content. Alright? Not content, because the different, stress would make different meanings. Alright? So the easy content, this is what you should start with when you're learning. But if you're doing tasks, for example, and you're organizing your day, yes, it's much better to start with something that is difficult, that is problematic, get it over with, and then you have the rest of the day to finish simple stuff. And it's usually the beginning of the day where you're most energetic. So don't confuse both ideas. Those who said start with the most difficult, they're talking about tasks in comparison to other tasks, and those who said start with the most the easiest thing, they're talking about the easiest thing to attain in learning. Alright, so they're talking about content, they're talking about the content of study. And then he mentioned the idea of recall, and he said something about doing that recall in writing. Alright, see, I want you to differentiate between different levels. All right. Now, let's suppose I'm reading this paragraph, for example, one of this bottom paragraph. All right. So, what am I supposed to do after I read that paragraph? I should check for understanding, or I should do a self-test, or in other words, I would try to recall. And recall is to perhaps cover this by a piece of paper or cover it by hand. And then what is required from me is to recall the things that Imam al-Zarnuji has mentioned in this particular paragraph. I'm not supposed to recite the words. I'm not supposed to mention in the very beginning every single detail that he has mentioned. But what am I supposed to do is to explain this paragraph. And not even in simple terms yet, but just a preliminary recalling of what I can remember that he talked about. And you work yourself through that. In the beginning, you find yourself, you remember one or two ideas, probably the main ideas, or the ones that you had your mind directed towards. What will be interesting if you write these two ideas down, and then you visit the paragraph again, read it, but this time read it to check, what I recalled, are they the most two important ideas? Why did I recall these two ideas in particular and not any other ideas? Why did I mention these two details? You might find because it's something that you have experienced before, something you have learned about before, something that caught your attention because of the way that it was written. Anything that involves multi-sensory perceptions. Most likely you'll find that. So the idea is work yourself out, work yourself through this paragraph. Understanding, covering, recalling, not reciting. So not memorizing the words without meanings. Alright? Unless you're studying something that is related to literature or studying something that requires you to remember the words. Alright? And he mentioned this afterwards, that somebody who's studying law, Islamic Sharia, is required to remember. Because this is the code. This is the code from which they judge in courts, so they must know the law, word for word. This is not something that you can extrapolate according to your understanding. It's something that you have to remember. All right? So if it's not something that I have to remember word for word, all that I need to remember is what? The meaning. Okay. And I don't have to remember the meaning in the same text or the same words of the writer. And also another issue, if I'm going to memorize the words, I should not memorize the words, or I should not memorize an amount that is too much for me to retain. If I develop this habit of memorizing things that I don't understand, they said it, and it was. You might say it's a little bit harsh, but they said that you would become eventually, dumb. You become stupid. Why? Because and because of this, people now are getting hesitant when we talk about memorization, because they realize they develop this habit of not using their critical thinking. So they associated the problem with memorization. They did not associate it with the way they memorized. Back then, they said, Imam Ibn Suraj, he said, understand my words. If you don't understand my words, memorize it. For you, if you memorize it, you'll understand it. And what he means is, if you memorize something, keep it in your mind. Now, when you're in your transportation, you can recall the sentence and think about it. While you're eating, you can think about it. Before you sleep, you can think about it. When you wake up, when you're getting dressed, if you say the sentence in your mind and you're trying to work it out. So now memory is facilitating for comprehension. This is the memorization they encouraged. You understand? Not mere memorization that does not, entail any kind of comprehension. All right? So again, recall what you're trying to recall, the meanings. Eventually, what you want to do is to do the recall for a 10 years old, level of English or Arabic, regardless of the language that you're studying. That is the content is written in. All right. If you reach this level of the ability to recall what is written in a paragraph, and you can explain the concept in simple words that any beginner would understand. And Feynman, the famous professor in physics, he used to go to the math department, and he would ask them, if you are able to explain to me anything, any mathematical concept that I don't know of before, but make sure that you explain it in simple words and don't mention anything that I don't know of. Don't use any terms that I haven't heard of before. If you do that, I guarantee that I come up with the same conclusion you came up with. You understand? So you go to somebody from a different expertise and ask them, explain your knowledge in simple words. And the challenge is, I come with the same academic conclusion, expert conclusion that you came up with. All right? And ever since, they use this method for learning sometimes and study. Have the student get out a piece of paper and do this Feynman transcript of things. Explain the topic in words that is suitable for a kid, for an elementary school kid, or a teenager in middle school, for example. All right. So what you need to do is to recall in that way. Recall also is not summarizing, because summarizing requires some kind of deep understanding. The summarizing, what you're doing is you're eliminating words, but you're keeping the meaning intact. And for you to do that, you must have deep knowledge, and at the same time of the thing that you're trying to summarize, and also good foundation in the language itself. To let you able to eliminate words, but at the same time pack knowledge in much shorter or fewer sentences. So summarizing is not necessarily a good way to do the recalling, unless you have a deep knowledge and at the same time you have good language for the summarizing to be correct. The same thing with rereading. You should not. The rereading is not that helpful. Like if you read the paragraph and you finish it, you can't understand it, and then you read the paragraph again, just reciting, vocalizing the words. That's not helpful. All right. Whether you're rereading it, back then I remember some students, some of my classmates used to study by, after they read a paragraph, they would write it, even if you don't understand it. That doesn't help. And the members of me said that doesn't help. If you write something you don't understand, what you're doing, the same gradual perceptual method, you're developing a habit of writing things you don't understand, or memorizing things you don't understand. So be careful of which habits you develop. Okay? And that's why here he did not mention memorizing. He said it's also essential to write down and extract of the material after memorizing, and to practice a great deal of repetition. So what he's saying, to extract something, you must understand it. See? He doesn't say that explicitly, but implicitly he's saying that you understood it. See, it is also essential to write down and extract. You cannot write down and extract unless you extracted that extract. You understand me? So the extract is something that you worked out through the reflection, trying to understand. Alright? And why would you do that? To facilitate memorization. See, here the Imam Zarnuji is clearly putting comprehension first and then memorization. Alright? Alright. And he mentioned in that paragraph as well, he said, for if reading is limited, but repetition and reflection are extensive, then the student will attain a firm grasp and understanding. The most important part is reflection. The most important part is that you're cognitively conscious when you read something. Alright, you are aware of what you're reading, and you're working out the text itself. Alright. And then he talks about this idea of, after he mentions a few poetic verses by Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad, and then he mentioned, and he's the Khalil ibn Ahmad, the judge, not the linguist, I believe. And then he mentioned the idea of discussion and argument and questioning. And this is now very, very popular. The idea of dialectic, they call it the Socratic dialectic method. The dialectic method, what they would do, the teacher is actually the one facilitating this, would play the devil's advocate, so to speak. And they would facilitate knowledge attainment from the point of view of discussions. They would hold like a discussion circle, and he or she, the teacher, would ask a question, and then they would respond. The student would respond, and they would challenge the student's understanding. You understood this, why not that? And then they would let another student take the counter argument, and going back and forth. And Imam Taqiyuddin al-Subki, also in Al-Tabaqat, when he's talking about his father, Taqiyuddin al-Subki, he explained how he used to teach him and his brothers and his students and his classmates, like the Taqiyuddin al-Subki's classmates. What Imam Taqiyuddin al-Subki used to do, he used to divide them into two groups. And he would say, you would take this position, like position A, and you would take this, position B. Now debate. Now, after they finish the first round, switch places. Not physical places, but switch positions. You take position B and so forth. They switch. After they switched, they want to ask them, so what do you think about this view? He mentioned something different, like position C, for example. And after he explained it totally, they said, MashaAllah, Alhamdulillah, we know the truth. He said, well, this is problematic actually. What I have mentioned has, the certain mistakes, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And after he explained what is wrong in position C, he mentioned position D that he actually adheres to. Alright? That's in Tabaqat al-Shafi'i. And this is how they used to learn. And this is 700 years ago. 700 years ago. This is how the Muslim jurists that now are being attacked in our very own language, Arabic. This is how they used to learn. All right.
And they claim to be like doing this recently, like creating this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're talking about the West, yeah, I mean, but again, the West is taking it from, you know, Socrates, for example. But again, the point is that we had these kind of, you know, professional approaches, you know, applied. All right. And then he talks about the, you know, in the same context, he takes an extension to this idea of questioning and arguments and discussion in learning, and he talks about the importance of study groups. And see, a Muslim should not promote for himself to be living individually, not in a herd, not in a clan or in a group. All right, this kind of yes, there's importance of individual responsibility in a group. This is obvious, but promoting the lifestyle of, you know, me, myself, and I, this is not correct. You know, in Surah Al-Fatiha, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, when He mentioned Ihdina as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, you're asking the right guided path. He mentioned after that Sirat al-Ladhina an'amta alayhim, the path of those who are guided, not only one. And Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi in his explanation, his tafsir, he mentioned, you know, one of the reasons because the power of one is less than the power of many. So you're asking Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to guide you to the right path, and also you're asking Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to guide you to be in that right path with a group, not alone. Because only one, you're weak being alone. You understand? This is very important. Many of us read the Fatiha and doesn't know this. So again, you need this in everything. The idea of teamwork. Everybody's talking about like something new. I mean, this isn't a Fatiha. You need teamwork. You understand? We read it how many times a day? Huh? So the idea is he makes an extension to the notion of discussion and takes it to a study group, and he mentions that study groups are not to be for mockery and, you know, competitions that are not healthy. And Professor Barbara Oakley from Learning How to Learn, the MOOC on Coursera, she was 1 out of 4, I believe, who wrote a research paper called "Turning Student Groups into Effective Teams." So the idea of student groups, they can be really helpful or they can bring you down. And the idea is you can incorporate in a study group people who are, you know, suffering academically. This is not a problem. Some people believe that a study group, for it to be you know, designed in a good way, all of the group members, all the study group members, all of them must be top students. That's not necessarily correct. You might need students who are, you know, they're not doing that great. And the reason out of this is you might find the top students explaining to those who are eager to learn but they don't understand yet. Alright? And it's a win-win situation. Those who don't understand yet will get the explanation from those who understand already. And those who understand already, by explaining things, they're doing the Feynman transcript. They're doing this a higher level of recall. They're practicing what they understood. So it's a win-win. It's not necessarily good to have everybody on the same level. Even in classes, a diversity of students is important. Because sometimes you have these brilliant students that finish up early and sit around, they don't know what to do. And here in Egypt, what do we do? Stay quiet. You know what? Sleep on the desk. Right? This is what you have been told in schools. You know, put your head on the desk and just sleep until the rest of them finish. What you should do, actually, a teacher should. All right, who's still struggling? You. All right, go tell him how to work it out. And now you're developing how classmates can help each other. You're helping them facilitate the knowledge, helping them not to be, you know, selfish. You're gaining so many benefits by this teamwork as a teacher. But unfortunately, not many teachers know the benefit of this. At home, you should do this as well between, you know, brothers and sisters and siblings. Have them coach each other on things. Alright? So the idea is, study groups are really important, and it's not a matter of level in academia or in understanding, but who's eager to learn. Alright? If you're organizing a study group to round up watching a movie, then this is what hurts. Being not eager or concerned about learning. If you're just coming for the fun of it, for socializing, then this is the problem. But if somebody is struggling academically, it's fine. Actually, sometimes it is positive. All right. So, and he does warn about some of these things, and also turning study groups into argumentations and debates that are not healthy. And scholars, Muslim scholars, not necessarily Imam Zarnuji, has mentioned that the way to bring out a different opinion in a study group is to say, how would we respond to somebody who would say so and so, even though it's your idea? You understand? So if Mustafa is saying something, for example, and we're in a study group, and I want to respond to him, all right, and we're both classmates, what I would do is, I would say, all right, interesting view, Mustafa, but what would you say if somebody brought about so and so to you? How would you respond to them? I don't bring it on as if I'm challenging him. So I don't build, rivalry in the study group. I don't make it full of tensions that we're competing who understands more. It's a study group. You're not getting the World Cup out of this. So people like to make things, challengeable for no reason. You understand? So you bring it on the voice of, a third person. How would we respond to them? This is actually how you should ask a sheikh as well, or a teacher. So sometimes you might provoke the teacher by saying, all right, if you say this, but I say that. You understand? But if you say this, well, okay, but how would you respond to somebody who would say to you so and so? All right? So, but you would not, train yourself on these techniques, and you would not develop this habit of how to work out a discussion on knowledge unless you form a study group. It's not necessarily to be successful from the very beginning, but the notion itself, the concern of having study groups must be there. And he mentioned how questioning and explaining can sometimes be much more efficient and facilitate long-term retention of knowledge better than mere repetition. So if you have questioning plus explaining equals repetition and more, because you're repeating the information. So long-term retention is facilitated, but at the same time, new questions are arriving. If I form a study group with Muhammad Zakari, aka Hisham, all right, if I facilitate a study group, and we're both, we're learning pairs, for example, and we're a pair of learners, we're learning together. So now the repetition is happening, but at the same time, Muhammad might be struggling with a point that I'm not struggling with, and perhaps that I did not even see. You understand? So he would bring out certain questions from the text or from the study, the content that we're studying, different than mine. And the more questions at hand, the more answers you will have. And the more answers you have, the deeper knowledge all of you will have, eventually. Rather than having just one mind thinking about things. See, a mind, when it approaches anything to study, you're usually directing yourself from a point of view that you have studied before. Every time you approach something new, you automatically look for something in that new endeavor that relates to something in the past. But each one of us has his own past. So each one of us has his own approach in studying something new. So it's one thing, if it's learning how to learn, it's new to all of us. But each one of you is coming from a different background, different experiences, different languages, social experiences, emotional experiences, everything, religious experiences. So that would shape the approach that you study something. So you will raise different questions than the person next to you. And you will answer things in a different way than the person next to you, and so on, and so on. This is why learning in groups is so important. All right. So again, questioning and explaining is repetition and more, as Imam Al-Zawji has mentioned. Then he moves on to another important point that he kind of, squeezed in. And it's an extension to the notion of collective learning. All right, because when we talk about study groups, we're talking about doing something collectively, in teams, in groups. So he mentions a sentence that we have to look at very attentively. He says, knowledge has this condition for the one who serves it. Knowledge has a condition for the one who serves it. Meaning a requirement. Knowledge requires from the one that serves knowledge. What does it require? That he should make all men the servants of knowledge. So if you are claiming that you're serving knowledge, your utmost, the most important requirement that knowledge puts as a condition on you is to facilitate knowledge. Right? I guess this is obvious and apparent in study groups. You're not there to create hostility and to create kind of, political, situations out of a study group and having people, take sides and stuff like that. This is one. This is one application, and this is why he took it as an extension from study groups. But the notion itself is much bigger than that. When we say knowledge has this condition for the one who serves it, that he should make all men the servants of knowledge. To me, if somebody is trying to use knowledge as a commodity, to buy and sell, and trying to get wealth out of knowledge as his main concern, I should not allow him to do that. Right? Because if you turn knowledge into a commodity, then you would start changing knowledge itself. Because you would start thinking about different measurements. Commodities that are being sold in markets, the way they measure, their success is by numbers and by money they get. And sometimes people buy bad things. Right? We can take cigarettes again as an example, as a persisting example with us today. Perhaps, yes. I mean, if you treat knowledge as something that you're selling, not something that you're facilitating, not something that you're serving, a teacher or somebody or a scholar is somebody who serves knowledge, not somebody that sells knowledge. So this is the condition, that you don't sell knowledge to people, and at the same time, you don't let people sell knowledge either. You understand? And this notion will come up later in this chapter as well, when he talks about how you finance yourself. That a learner must finance himself, and the learner must have, or the scholar must have, a source of knowledge other than knowledge itself. Because if your source of knowledge, if your source of money is your knowledge, eventually, this knowledge will be molded in a way that fits the requirements of people. Alright? And most people, they're ignorant about what you have. Otherwise, all of them are scholars. If you're a scholar in something, then the rest are not scholars. Right? Most likely. I mean, some of them would be scholars with you, but the rest are just, they're ignorant. They're still learning. They want they're waiting for you to educate them. You understand? So if you turn this into a commodity, then you're not serving knowledge. You're serving money. You understand? And that's why financing knowledge is very important. That's why you have, endowments, for example, in the West. That's why you have scholarships. That's why you have, universities do funding. That's why students and graduate students learn how to seek funding for the research. You understand? They don't go out for businesses, kissing their hands and waiting for them to give them money. All right, there are academic funds that people apply for, and according to certain criteria. And yes, sometimes there are problems with these things, and sometimes people lose focus. But eventually, students get funding from academic funds, and businesses that support these academic funds are, their intentions are somewhat reviewed. You understand? So the scholar becomes eventually, he has the freedom to say what he wants or what she wants. But if the person is always waiting for the money that's coming from the people, then, he becomes perhaps afraid. If I say something that they don't like, they will stop coming. They will stop paying money. And if they stop coming, you might not care if you're a scholar. But if they stop paying, and you got no other source of financing your life, it becomes, it becomes a huge obstacle. And then you would have to compromise. Either compromise your life or compromise your knowledge. And then when you have family and wife and children, and at the same time you have knowledge, and you need money, and then you start having the devil saying to you, well, you can mix both, and you need money to even buy books, right? And it's not wrong. You can say an opinion that's not that correct. Somebody has said that opinion before. Then this doesn't become knowledge anymore. So, putting knowledge as a product is a problem. And it remains in the East a big problem. Why? Because we don't have awqaf, we don't have endowments anymore. So scholars will remain suffering because they don't have a source of money to finance their lives and their families. And if we say that nations that don't eat from their hands, like Sheikh Sha'arawi has said, if you don't eat from the making of your own hands, then your decision will not come from your own mind, right? Well, same thing. That happens to a nation. That happens to a person. If you are waiting for people to put the food on your table, you're always, making sure that, they're saying you're a good man. Alright? To get the rida, get their acceptance. And, I hope that this is something that I don't delve into one day. Alhamdulillah. So far, I have not been walking down that road. Alright. We'll cover a couple more items. And, it seems that we'll not be even able to finish chapter 7 today. Interesting. I thought that chapter 6. I apologize. Okay. He talks after that. He talks also about the importance of reflection and how if you reflect on subtle materials, intricate issues that are not that apparent, how the continuous effort in trying to grasp subtle differences is important. And there have been philosophically speaking, there have been two opinions out there in the Islamic tradition. One of Ibn Sina, and the other one is by Musa ibn Maymun, or Moses, the son of Maimonides. Alright? In his book called Dalil al-Ha'irin, or the guide, or Dalil al-Ha'irin, I can't recall. The guide of the perplexed. Alright? And Moses, Moses, son of Maimonides, or Musa ibn Maymun, he's originally a Jewish scholar, but he wrote this book in Arabic. Alright? And because he grew up in, Andalusia. So he grew up in a Muslim culture, but he is Jewish, so he wrote in Arabic. And he wrote in a sense of, you would feel the Islamic culture in the way he writes. Okay? So you might find someone who has an Islamic culture, but he's not a Muslim. And anyone who lives in a Muslim country and says, I don't have an Islamic culture, you're joking. And also Muslims who live in Western countries, they have Western cultures. Don't joke yourself. At some point you assimilate. That's not necessarily bad. But the point is you have to know the difference between a culture and a religion. And don't mix both of them, the way Salafis do. And if you mix culture and religion, you get ideology, which is something different. They turn religion into ideology. And religion is not ideology. Right? We don't want to get into politics. Alright. But these are three distinct ideas. Three distinct concepts. You have to understand them. So Ibn Sina believes that if you keep your focus on something subtle, that the work of the mind is different than the work of the senses. You see, because Musa ibn Maymun, after Ibn Sina, what he said the mind is like the eyes. If you exhaust your eyes looking at something that is really subtle for a long period of time, eventually you will lose your eyesight. Or you will weaken, the eyesight will get weakened. However, on the other hand, this is what Ibn Sina has been saying. If you use your mind for a long period of time trying to grasp something, a meaning that is difficult, eventually you will develop the habit of being able to indulge into intricate matters and subtle differences. Things that are very, in terms of meanings, very complex and difficult. Alright? He said, but those who believe that, not those who believe, but when the person, after doing that for a long period of time, gets tired, you're not getting tired because of your mind getting tired, but because of your brain. Because they distinguish between the mind and the brain. Alright? The brain is physical, and the brain is the facilitating tool for the mind. So he said the mind is not weakened, actually. The mind will wait for the brain to restart, to get sleep, to have some rest, and come back. When coming back to study again, the mind is ready. The mind will grasp difficult information. Alright? So if you spend 2 hours, for example, trying to understand something really difficult, you'll find yourself getting tired. Ibn Sina says, this is not because of your mind. This is because of your brain, your physical part of yourself. So take rest, come back. When you come back, do you find information? Yes. Can you work out through it? Yes. Then there's a difference between the mind and the brain and how they work. Moses, son of Maimonides, in Dialectic, he mentioned something different. He said that the mind is like the eye. And if you use your mind in difficult stuff for a long period of time, you'll go astray, so to speak. You will lose your mind. Alright? I prefer Ibn Sina's opinion. Alright, and Ibn Sina said that explicitly in Al-Najah, in his book, Al-Najah. Okay. And then on page 50, he starts talking about wisdom and how a Muslim should accept wisdom regardless the source of it. That wisdom is like, something that you have lost. And you keep looking for it everywhere. Trying to trace it. And this is the analogy, and this is from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Something that you lost and you're trying to find. Or that wisdom is the goal, is the target of the mu'min, of the believer. He's always looking to reach it. And here I guess he's referring also to the point of cognitive biases. Imam al-Ghazali in Al-Munqidh, Dalal, in the deliverance from error. He talks about how a wise person would look for the truth between the lines of a deviator. He says, in Arabic, what is very close to يبحث عن الحق. He looks for the truth. في مضامين كلام أهل الباطل. Something of that sort. How's that? That he builds that if you say something wrong one time, that's just not necessarily wrong every time that you say something wrong. If you say 10 things that are wrong, you might say the 11th point might be correct. You might say something wrong from 10 perspectives, but from the 11th perspective what you're saying is correct. You might say something that is wrong in a context, but correct in a different context. You might say something wrong because of a wrong approach, but in itself it's not necessarily wrong. You might say something wrong because the way you said it, but not the meaning that you meant, and so on. Alright? But again, this is not for a beginner. Right? This is for somebody who is, worked himself through the ladder of knowledge. But what he's trying to point out, not to fall in cognitive biases like what they call the herd instinct, or not to in the social proof that they call. If something is popular, then it must be correct. So if somebody is known for saying wrong things, well, he might say something correct, right? And this would develop, the habit of being just and being fair. Every single time I give you the deserved amount of examination and testing of what you're trying to say, regardless of your past history, for example. Yes, I might take this past history in consideration when I'm trying to evaluate, but I don't stereotype. All right, and this is important in knowledge. This is important in dealing with teachers, with dealing with academic content, with dealing with different views, especially in things that are very related to concepts, not application, like philosophy, for example. All right, so he talks about this. And this realm of cognitive biases have been now written, there are books written into that, like Think Clearly, I can't remember the name of the writer now. They group cognitive biases and they explain them, just like the logical fallacies. Also, a learner, a beginner, has to have some kind of idea about logical fallacies. Otherwise, you cannot apply critical thinking. To be a critical thinker, you have to understand how logical fallacies, how logical mistakes are committed. Alright? Otherwise, you cannot tell. It will be just questioning things. Okay? And then he talks about the importance of questioning. And, حسن السؤال نصف العلم. A good question is half of knowledge. And this has an etymological background as well. We say in Arabic, the notions or the ideas that are covered in a book, we call it masail. Alright? And it comes from su'al. It's like questions. And these are answers for. So half of knowledge are questions. Most of the discoveries were originally questions. People had a question, people had a problem. In Arabic we say al-haja ummul ikhtira', right? We say that need is the mother of invention, right? The need itself is a question, something that you're trying to answer. So good questions is half of knowledge. The better you're able as a learner to develop questions, the better learner you are. Imam al-Farabi has a book called Al-Huruf, or the letters, and he talks about the role of each question. Like the question of what, the question of how, the question of why, and the role of that to the learner while studying. What is the role of each question? Alright? And then he comes back again on page 51 talking about what I mentioned to you earlier about financing knowledge. Alright? And what was really interesting here, he mentioned the idea about depending on yourself and having your own, that scholars used to be craftsmen and so forth. But he mentioned something that I really liked. Perhaps this idea of craftsmen will come also after that. But he mentioned something that I liked. He said, it was said to a learned man, by what means did you acquire knowledge? How did you acquire knowledge? He said, through a rich father. And it struck me. And of course here there's this kind of a metaphor. See, some parents, like my father, he is not a rich man, but he decided to spend all his money in the education of his children. You understand? And some people might think, oh, you're rich. Well, no, I just choose to spend my money in education. You understand? Not a lot of people know that. But even as a student, I used to, buy books rather than going to the movies or, having, social hangouts and so forth. That doesn't mean necessarily that, that I'm a millionaire. I just decided to spend my money in a different way. All right, and it tells something about the role of fathers in our lives. They're extremely important. All right, and I'm one of the people, without my father, I believe everything that I have learned in my life, everything, it's either because of my father, like directly from him, or it's because something like a knowledge venue that my father has facilitated for me. I wouldn't be sitting here today if it weren't for him. Understand? Totally. If it weren't for him, I would not be wearing what I'm wearing, not be saying what I'm saying, not be able to explain what I'm explaining. Everything is because of him. All right? And, you keep that in mind. How much parents, they spend time and effort, and they go through struggles and challenges for you to become an educated man in the 20th or the 21st century. How difficult that is, and how they suffer so much for you to learn something. All right, and some of us take that seriously, and others, take that opportunity for granted. See, they're not here spending money to feed you out of human instincts. They're doing that they're working your mind. They're helping you to work your mind with knowledge, with information, with sometimes having a profession, and that itself is extremely important. It's probably more important than feeding you food and water. Now you're grown up. You're in college or in high school. You can do physical work, right? But they facilitate your college tuition, for example. In Egypt, things are different than the U.S. Most people, we depend upon our parents until we're, in the 20s, in the early 20s, right? So for them to take that, yes, you might think that they have, strange ideas, strange views of things, how they view life. But when it comes to, your future, they're doing everything they can. And for that, you should be extremely grateful. I should be extremely grateful. Okay. And taking the point also, again, the point of financing knowledge and why it's extremely important, coming back to this point. A learner nowadays, you must be able to discern and be able to go through every single source of knowledge, squeeze it, take everything that you can possibly get out of it. All right? And what I mean by this, they're different. Now, the online sources for knowledge, they're huge, right? Back then they had trouble. See, they're talking about how they can finance buying books and how it's extremely difficult. They either buy it or they would rent it to copy it with their own hands. Imagine copying like 10 volumes out of a book, copying it, by hand. And the kind of mistakes that might occur out of the copying. And then you try to review it and to double check with other copies of your, learning mates and so forth. Back then this is their karama. You understand? This is their great work. We have this idea of karama that, having food without, a normal source in front of you. Well, actually, learning in that kind of circumstance and achieving what they have achieved in these circumstances, put yourself now in the same circumstances they have been put in. This is some type of karama. When you find the Imam al-Nawawi dying, in the 40s, or even before that, and writing all of these books, there's no one house in certain countries that doesn't have a copy of Riyadh al-Salihin. Riyadh al-Salihin, Arba'in Nawawiyya, explaining Sahih Muslim, writing al-Minhaj, which is the source of Shafi'i jurists in their judging for many years after. Alright? Rawd al-Talibin, or Rawdat al-Talibin. It was summarized in Rawd al-Talibin. But, having all of these books written in a very short period of time and being able to physically sustain that in a short period of time, this is something out of sainthood. This is how awliya, because somebody was talking about this last time. Yes, to me, this is their karama. Alright? But again, these are the type of questions that they had at stake, the kind of challenges that they had to, how can I finance my knowledge? Yes, there has been awqaf, endowments, and they had requirements to be, enlisted in a certain endowment. There would be certain requirements, an endowment that you would get monthly allowance. Learners would go to schools where they would live throughout the year. They would only go out for a short period of time for a break to visit their families, come back, live in a dorm, and they would study all day long, and they would get a certain allowance, and they would have to keep up to a certain performance. This is happening in the West, and it's very sad it's not happening here. In the West, if you succeed in high school, you apply for a scholarship. Sometimes you get paid tuition and paid, a place in a dorm room, in a dorm facility, and everything that any kind of education that you're receiving it for free. But you must keep up a certain grade level, a certain GPA, otherwise you're kicked out, kind of. You must maintain that. Even for those who participate in sports. If you're in a university basketball team, you must, and you're getting the scholarship because of your basketball skills, not because of your academic level. You must keep up at an academic level for you to play in the basketball team. If you get an F in a quiz, you might not be playing the next game. This is not just in movies, this is real. And I witnessed personally, some things like that. I saw people going through these things. So the idea of financing knowledge for people, having scholarships, and note how, and this is something for us to reflect on. I don't have an answer for it. I don't mean to get into this whole capitalism versus communism, socialism, things of that sort. But think about it, when public universities, or when universities became free all of a sudden, how did that help or hinder learning? Alright? Or should it have been through some sort of requirements that entail effort? Because here the student, even if I get 50, even if I get 60, I'm 60% out of 100, I'm getting in a university. I'll get into some kind of college. I will get a BA eventually. And a BA just becomes a social, condition that I'm trying to achieve. It's not learning anymore. It's not education. It's not to have it as a profession. I'm just getting some kind of a qualification to put it in an ID and to be able to get into a decent marriage that suits my family status. That's it. So you're working 4 years out of nothing. And then you come, and some people ask me, I can't find a goal in learning because of these things. And if we need to work on learners, we need to work on learners from elementary school. Not to wait until university, college level. From university school, from elementary levels, before they reach middle school and high school. Think, what are you? The better you work hard. If you don't develop, the persistence and the perseverance now, you cannot develop it later, or at least it will be very difficult to develop. So the idea is they had these questions at stake, and we need to think about this now. Online, venues have been opening up, and for free. If you can take a course on Coursera and you apply for financial aid, and you can get a verified certificate. Right? It's for free. And what is holding us back? Now, because we developed this habit of not taking knowledge seriously. But back then, when they had to finance their knowledge, when they had to apply for endowments, please, the Maliki school, can I become a student with you guys? The Shafi'i school, am I allowed here? No, you're not. Try the school next to us. Well, in the US, yes, you do a college application and you would send them. How would you finance my education? Well, yes, 25%. 25. Let me apply to another one. And you ask for recommendation letters. That used to happen back then. I have the ijazah of the sheikh. Can I come? This sheikh says that I can enter. May you please allow me here. Same thing. And they even discuss some things like, for how long can we sustain a beginner? Like, if you remain in the levels as a beginner, for how many years? Until we have to kick you out. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has mentioned something from Al-Ma'yar Al-Mu'rib by Al-Wansharisi. He said that sometimes that the answer that they received, 10 years. You can say 10 years. I looked for it. I did not find it, though, in Ma'yar Al-Mu'rib. So perhaps he found something that I could not find. But the idea is, I asked, Imam Suyuti also discussed this method. For how long a learner, or who's a beginner to be entered in a certain endowment, in a certain scholarship? Which beginner should we? What are the Shafi'i requirements for a beginner, for example? And each one deserves a certain allowance. Each level of learners deserve a certain allowance. In India, until now, in Malibar, they do this. Kind of. My Sheikh Abdul Nasir Malibari, he studied in a dorm. He would leave his family for a whole year. He was very much surprised by Al-Azhar, unfortunately. But in Malibar, he used to leave his family for a whole year, go to a dorm, study from Fajr until Isha, and he would sleep. Next day is a new day. And they would take different halaqat, different circles, and go through learning. Very similar to college courses, right? You should. Some people just take especially here in the East, we only get the idea of college parties in dorm rooms. I apologize, I have to mention this, but sometimes you only get this because out of movies, we believe that a college life is just parties. That's not true. I'm not saying this doesn't happen, but I'm just saying that if you reduce universities, studying to just parties, then you're not being just and fair with that culture itself. You're not judging the American culture fairly. You understand? There are people who fail college because they're not doing their work. People who suffer until the end of their lives because they did not take college seriously. That's it. Period. Beginning of the sentence. Done. Over. So we take things sometimes in the terms of movies. So that's not true. And the sad thing that this is happening in so-called non-Muslim countries. In Muslim countries, we're not able to sustain learners in certain things. All right, and we go through hardships to provide free knowledge and free courses and free teaching. We even develop the habit of, if something is for free, people not take it seriously. That's another question. If it's for free, Egyptians will only learn if you get them paying money. I have heard this for so long. If they don't pay money, they don't take it seriously.
That's true.
See? That's the point.
Not for me, but for so many people think so.
Well, then this must be addressed. This must be addressed because you're not sustaining that forever. Because again, we're only thinking of knowledge.